Welcome. Welcome. This is an event sponsored by the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. My name is Peter Hitchcock, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center. I'm joined here today by my friend and colleague, Ashley Dawson, and Trevor Ngwane, who of course is our honored guest. I'll be doing a more formal introduction of Ashley in a moment. But initially, I wanted to thank Mary Taylor, our assistant director, and Thea Hastings for helping to put together this event. For those of you who don't know about the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, we do have a website on the main Graduate Center webpage that you can link to. But obviously, we've been around at the GC for over 20 years now, and we're intensely interested in work that I would say thinks about not just radical activism, but intellectual production through that activism. And I think Dr. Ngwane here is a good example of the kinds of work that we're interested in at the center. We have a year-long seminar that is split between graduate fellows and faculty fellows, and some invited international guests when they have time and we have the ability to organize it. And we also sponsor an annual conference that, well, Mary, I'm not sure, is it going to take place this year or not? But we're hoping to have something closer to in-person. Obviously, like many other research centers and institutions, programming has been undermined by the pandemic, but we'll see what the new year brings. However, do follow the activities that we sponsor through the CPCP website. Mary's put something in the chat around that. And do encourage your friends, colleagues, and activists that you know to join in the conversations that we encourage. All right, so let me say something about the format today in our Hollywood Squares. After I have introduced Ashley, Ashley will introduce Trevor, and then Trevor will talk for a little bit about the new book that he's published, Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South African Shack Settlements. And that should be about, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, Trevor, right? And then Ashley and I will ask some pointed questions of our honored guest, but really in the spirit of trying to develop a conversation around the political and social significance of shack settlements in South African life at this moment in history, and its connections, its transnational connections with similar social formations. And then what I'm hoping is our audience will have a chance to ask questions themselves. And if you could post your question in the chat, we will field those questions in the order that we see them, okay? And that will be, at that point in the conversation, it will be much more general, with Trevor going backwards and forwards, not just between Ashley and I, but with anybody who cares to engage in the conversation. So we'll try to keep it as open, informative, and as detailed as possible. But that's the general format. Don't think I've missed anything there, but hopefully some of you also have read this book, and if you haven't yet, I do recommend that you purchase it from Pluto Press immediately, and we'll be taking down names of those of you who refuse to do that. Ashley Dawson is a professor in the English department, both at the Graduate Center. I almost said here at the Graduate Center, forgetting, of course, that I'm in the ether of the internet, and at the College of Staten Island. Of his many books, the recent ones include People Power, Extreme Cities, and Extinction. A lot of Ashley's work obviously is around radical eco-criticism and environmentalism, and much of his work in post-colonial studies, which is something that we are both interested in, also links to those environmental concerns. I would describe Ashley as an honorable transnationalist, or perhaps post-nationalist. But anyway, Ashley, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to you so that you might introduce Dr. Ngwane.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Peter. It's really nice to share a virtual stage with you. And thanks to Mary and Thayer and the Center for Place Culture and Politics in general for hosting this event. I'm so excited that we get to connect with Trevor around his new book and his long history of activism. You know, for all the downsides of this era of Zoom, we get to have Trevor with us and get the latest from his work in South Africa with various social movements. So Trevor and I were probably in some rooms together back in 2011 when I attended the UN Climate Summit in Durban. But we weren't introduced to one another until about 1.5 years ago when our mutual friend, Patrick Bond, put me in touch with Trevor after I published my book on energy democracy. Trevor's the person to talk to, Patrick said, and to find out about radical movements in South Africa relating to energy democracy. And so I had a conversation with Trevor about his work in the early 2000s with the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. And so the context for the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee was that there was a lot of pressure on utilities in South Africa to privatize, to kind of cut back as part of a trend of neoliberalization that was going across utilities in general in South Africa. And so the dominant public utility, which was called Eskom, was switching from charging fixed rates for electricity to charging per kilowatt hour. And that led electricity rates to rise astronomically. And people in South Africa, particularly people in the townships, really struggled to pay their electricity bills. But the government and the utility talked about a kind of culture of non-payment, which came out of the apartheid era, and said that this culture had continued, and therefore they had to deal with people who were refusing to pay, in their opinion, their bills in a kind of draconian fashion. And so they were cutting people off from power, which placed them in really serious danger. So the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, which Trevor was very much involved with, started Operation Khanyisa, which trained local people to reconnect households that had been cut off from the grid. And by doing that, they not only gave people access to power once again that they could use for cooking and for heat and for other necessities of life, but they placed collective pressure on Eskom and on the government to switch away from this kind of privatized mentality to seeing electricity as a human right, and to kind of completely change the structure that the utility worked under. So this is really, really important work. And Trevor went on to build on it by working with the Anti-Privatization Forum, which was fighting around similar kinds of trends in other utilities like water provision and also evictions of people in townships, played a really important role in efforts to roll back neoliberalism and to fight the ANC's adoption of those kinds of policies. And all of this built on a long prior history of activism. Trevor, for instance, when he first began work as a lecturer at Wits University in Johannesburg, became involved in the Workers' Literacy Project that was teaching literacy to workers at the university, so that, you know, there was a kind of radical connection between the messages that he was putting out as a member of the sociology department around social movements and the actual conditions of labor in the institution where he was teaching. Trevor went on to be a member of the Transport Workers Union and to be engaged in union struggles in the post-apartheid moment. And then he was also an elected council member for the Pimville ward in Soweto, where there was an effort to engage in participatory budgeting. And again, those efforts ran afoul of kind of neoliberalization trends in the post-apartheid period in South Africa. So those are only a few of the many grassroots struggles that Trevor has been involved in. And of course, he's continued this work. And he's also a prolific author. So he teaches sociology at the University of Johannesburg. You know from what Peter said that he's just published a book with Pluto Press called Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South African Shack Settlements. Prior to that, he published a book in 2013 called Service Delivery Struggles in Post-Apartheid South Africa, which documents and theorizes some of the movements that I alluded to, obviously from a kind of participant activist perspective. And then in 2017, Trevor co-edited the book Urban Revolt, State Power and the Rise of People's Movements in the Global South. It was published by Haymarket Books. And it's a fascinating study looking at people's movements, particularly movements in cities where the majority of mankind lives, and particularly at those movements in Global South cities. So I really encourage you to check out Trevor's work, and as Peter suggested, certainly to buy the latest book, Amakomiti, from Pluto Press. And we're, I think, going to talk about some of the insights that come out of that book, although I hope we'll also get to some of the struggles that Trevor's been centrally involved in and some of his previous published work. So Trevor, welcome once again. It's so exciting to have you with us. And I'll turn the stage over to you to talk about your work. Thanks for agreeing to be part of this discussion. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Okay, sorry, it happens to everyone. Yeah, thank you, Ashley. That's a real wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks, Peter and Mary, for being part of organizing this and being here tonight. I think with you it's afternoon. And thanks to everyone who's on this webinar, wherever you may be in the world. But I must say, hello, New York. I think that if I was to take a sabbatical, I would do it at CUNY because I've got so many friends and comrades there. One of them is Manny Ness, with whom, we co-edited that first book, on Urban Revolt, which Ashley was talking about. So I also want to thank my publishers, Pluto Press, and then also Chakana Media in Johannesburg, volunteered to publish the book, and they're doing a good job at distributing it locally. And I understand that the director, Maggie Davis, is somewhere in New York. So New York is home. So we all know that a wise speaker always thinks of his or her audience when preparing a talk. So as I was preparing for tonight, for today, a question came to my mind. Why would a New Yorker be interested in this book about committees in the shack settlements of South Africa? So I was quite surprised, how easily and how many reasons came to my mind. Okay, so this was like a surprise, because I asked myself formally, why would a New Yorker, so I'll just state a few reasons. Yeah, of course, the book is about how shack dwellers in South Africa, there's about 10 million people who call a shack their home in a population of between 50 and 60 million people. So it's a substantial 20% of the people in the country live in shacks. Remember also that some people live in what we call backyard shacks. So they're not standalone. It's not a shack settlement. It's a shack at the back. Sometimes you find 10 shacks, and that 10 million, I'm not sure, some of them are not counted in that 10 million. But I'm sure, in our discussion, we'll go into those questions in detail. So, but if you are in Manhattan, why should you read this book? Well, the first thing is the working class is an agent of change wherever it is in this capitalist world. Antonio Gramsci wrote that workers are not just the wage slaves of capital. Workers are producers. They produce with their own hands the goods and services which society needs. And in fact, it was on that basis that Marx said the working class is the revolutionary subject, the group that has the power and the motivation to overthrow the capitalist system. So I think today, of course, with feminist perspectives, especially the radical feminist movement, we now know that it is not just those who receive wages from selling their labor to the capitalists who we can call part of the working class, because there's a lot of unpaid labor that people do. So, for example, in South Africa, the migrant labor system was heavily reliant on the unpaid labor of women who would be left behind in the rural areas, the so-called native reserves, the Bantustans. And these women were required to take care of affairs while the men went to work in the mines, digging gold and diamonds. So the women had to take care of the fields, the cattle, the children, the old and the sick, including returning miners who were of no use, to the mine owners. Now, we know that, as Marx said classically, workers are those who work, who do the work. The capitalist class are the people who own and control production. So the main division under this society is between labor and capital. Of course, in the US, you guys might use a different terminology called the working class, the middle class. And also you find that countries have different histories. For example, in the US, slavery played a central role in the creation and shaping of the working class. In South Africa, as I've mentioned, the migrant labor system was key in this respect. In both countries, racism and settler colonialism were central. And in fact, one can use the term racial capitalism to describe both economies. So in my book, I argue that shack dwellers are part of this class, the working class. I try to show through history and sociology how those who live in the shacks are best understood in these terms, in these Marxian terms. So as such, shack dwellers must be seen as an important force in the struggle for social justice under capitalism. If you live in New York and read the book, I hope you will think long and hard about how the working class, or the middle class, if you like, remain the revolutionary subject. According to Gramsci, workers have an organic capacity to lead the struggle. That is, the question really is just how to recognize and release this capacity. So there are many obstacles sometimes put in the way, of this capacity. It is not intellectuals like ourselves on this webinar who can change history. It is the action of millions and millions of workers, of ordinary people. And some of these people live in the world's shacks, slums, barrios, favelas, ghettos, etc. And these people must be approached with respect because they are the ones who will change history and make a better world. Another reason, if you're in New York and in any other part of the world, is that there is a hunger for democracy, in the world today. I mean, in the US, you guys had President Trump, and there are many such political leaders in the world who leave us thinking and wondering about bourgeois democracy. Lenin once said, democracy in general does not exist. Democracy happens in the context of a class-divided capitalist society, divided into rich and poor, exploiter and exploited. So democracy under capitalism is capitalist democracy, bourgeois democracy. We saw towards the end of the 20th century and early 21st century, many movements that suggested that the millions and millions have a profound dissatisfaction with bourgeois democracy. Even though, in some countries like the Arab Spring, Egypt, people were fighting for democracy. But, even there, when they did win democracy, so many problems, came up because of the limited nature of capitalist democracy. So there was a feeling, for example, in many parts of the world, including the USA, that people vote and then the politicians, they govern in the name of the people, but the people themselves often have very little say over what happens. So you have governments implementing austerity measures, cutting down on social expenditure, and making the very people who elected them to suffer. The Occupy movement in the US was partly, I think, a demand for economic democratization. People were rebelling against the power of the 1% who dictate over the fate of the 99%. So my book suggests that the search for alternatives, for alternative forms of democracy, for participatory democratic models of governance should take us to the everyday democratic practices of the people who live in the shacks. These people, through their self-organization, they run their own affairs with their leaders answerable directly to their constituencies. Okay, I don't want to say much more, but let me say maybe one last point. Now, the third point for New York and everyone else, the struggle happens both in the workplace and in the living space. So many labor organizers, those who fight for workers' rights, tend to focus on the workplace, understandably so. The book argues that the struggle of the working class must stand on two legs, 2 feet, if you like, the workplace and the living space. So if it stands on one, it hops along. The home is a site of struggle in the struggle between labor and capital. So in a way, we have to follow the workers home. I think in the USA, we saw clearly during the 2008 economic meltdown, people losing their houses, foreclosures, all those are part of the struggle between labor and capital, between the rich and the poor. And then my very important point, which I wouldn't have done justice to my book and to this talk if I don't mention it, but you never know where our conversation will lead us. Peter, Mary, and Ashley, and the audience. It's very important to me that, in our struggle for this or for that, we have a vision of an alternative power, what I call the fight to overthrow the government of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, and replace it with a government of the working class, of the masses of ordinary people. So this is most important for me because I found that, in all the protests, the struggles, this is often missing, this vision, this desire, this dream that we can create a world where those in power are not, the money bags, but it is the workers themselves. It is ordinary people, the masses, the hoi polloi, who actually run society in the interest of everyone. So, if you read my book, the theme hopefully comes through quite clearly. So thank you very much for this opportunity again. Let the games begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Fascinating taste of some of the kind of key themes of your book. I thought maybe it would be useful to start by asking you a question which gives people listening a little bit more background. So, obviously the shack dwellers movement comes out of a history of efforts to prevent the Black majority in South Africa from being able to move to cities, the pass system and influx control during the apartheid government. So in your book, you mentioned some of the really important struggles during the apartheid era against that system and movements that pushed the government into building some dwellings. I thought maybe it might be useful, since people are probably somewhat familiar with that history, it might be useful if you talked a little bit about how the ANC government, once it got into power with the end of apartheid in 1994, what the ANC government did or did not do, both in terms of trying to build dwellings, but also in terms of the sort of legal structures around people's right to dwell in certain places. For instance, you mentioned people living in kind of backyard shacks. So, being able to clarify when the government viewed people as legitimately living in places and when it didn't, and how that affected people's struggles. I think that might be a really kind of useful way to start in terms of just sort of setting some of the background for the conditions that people are struggling under.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think to be fair to the ANC government, the government of Nelson Mandela, because, from me, it will get a hammering tonight. But remember that we got our independence, uhuru, freedom, in 1994. So this was at the height of the neoliberal triumphalism of, which began with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. So the move away from the social democratic conception of the state, the move away from the welfare state, the idea that the state must take a backward stance, let the market rule. So whereas during our struggle, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we, the ANC, Mandela and them in jail, were pushing for that, driven by that conception of a social democratic state. So when they took power, they were told, hey, the state must no longer be the leader, allow the markets. So the mistake and the political betrayal is that the ANC government actually abandoned its earlier program, its orientation towards using the state to develop and roll back, the legacy of apartheid, of capitalism, of colonialism, and embrace neoliberalism. It was so bad and dramatic to the extent that One day, Nelson Mandela was on a plane going overseas, where unfortunately he met some captains of industry, the World Bank. When he left, he was talking about nationalization. We must take over the banks, take over the factories, the mines, the farms, so that we can use these to improve the lot of our people, particularly the Black people. But on the way back, he said, guys, forget it, comrades. We must step back and allow the market to take over. It was so dramatic. Yeah, and since then, we've seen the market, what I can call a trickle-down economic model, where first make the rich richer, give money to the capitalists, allow them to make profit, allow them to move their country around in and out of the country, and then hopefully, we can get something for the working class. From that point of view, therefore, ordinary people have suffered because there's been slow economic change. In fact, the slogan here, even among the bourgeoisie, people accept, yes, those guys, those people, they got their political liberation, but they must still work on economic emancipation. Everyone agrees. But it's only because, the ANC decided to follow the path of neoliberalism.
Maybe I could ask a question, Trevor. It's actually a couple of things that I was thinking of as I was reading your book, which, I think one thing that you might do for our audience is say something a little bit more about your research methodology in engaging in the committees, right? Because you visit dozens of them, right? And it takes a lot of work, and so something about how that experience of doing that research and how is there sort of a magic number there where you begin to understand how political consciousness works within those committees in among the shack dwellings, right? So something along those lines, but also I was thinking about the consciousness in general, right? From just what you were saying about the ANC once they came to power, and perhaps the pole, as it were, of neoliberalism beginning to dominate the way they thought about political constituency and political action on the ground in South Africa. Because it seems to me that one of the things that's so striking about the book is that the committees themselves act as a sort of a lever of political consciousness, right? Vis-a-vis what the government isn't doing, but also are responding to a political consciousness among the folks who are living in the settlements and the shack dwellings themselves, right? So there's something organic about consciousness raising within this particular context, and I think it's perhaps that organic nature of the political, not just the spontaneity, but the actual living day-to-day aspects of raising political consciousness that sort of drive this research project for you in some way. So I'd love to hear about, how you connect your methodology to what you're actually seeing on the ground in the shack dwellings themselves. And maybe, this is part of a more general conversation then about this grassroots democracy, as you're calling it, a sort of a politics from below.
Yeah. So, if we say the working class is the revolutionary subject, it means that a lot of our work, our time must be spent, trying to work out where is the working class at politically. Exactly, Peter. What is the mass consciousness? what is of concern to ordinary people. What are they thinking? Now, we've got an old saying here, for those who believe in this paradigm of workers first, so we say, or we used to say, look, if you can't hear what workers are saying, you must listen harder, okay? Yeah. So the book, my research was in a way an attempt to listen harder, to get closer to how ordinary working class people understand politics in their everyday, okay? Because remember, the idea of the working class having that organic capacity arises not from politics, but from the condition they find themselves in their everyday. Of course, this must be, changed, developed, towards, a sharp, even revolutionary political consciousness. But working class people, if we talk about organic capacity, what they already are is the basis for what they can become. Okay? Yeah. Whereas with middle class people like ourselves, we have to read, we have to be influenced by our grandparents. Some of us have to visit Africa and come back. Yeah, man, I think this system is not okay. Yeah. Whereas with ordinary workers in their daily life, they are being squeezed, oppressed, exploited, and pushed to respond, to survive. And this is what Marx was talking about, okay? And then he goes on then to say, so those people, they need their own political party, they need to develop a certain consciousness, but basically it's what they are, their role, their location within capitalism. Now, I was looking for that organic capacity among what I thought was a neglected component or sector or section of the working class. In South Africa, as in other countries, shack dwellers are viewed, with a bit of condescension. Can you see? Yeah, oh, poor shack dwellers, yeah. Some crude Marxists might even use the term lumpen proletariat. Certainly the bourgeoisie and liberal scholars, they like to call them the underclass, okay? Sometimes they're even mischievous and try to present this underclass as having interests which are not, similar or complementary to those of the working class, okay? Yeah, so my idea was, let me find out, informed by Marx's understanding, because it also depends what you are looking for. And I think visiting more than 100 settlements was important for me because remember, before I conducted this research, I had been an activist for 2 decades, 3 decades. I had been working with leaders of shack settlements, social movements, and myself too, I did have that tendency to only look at workers or at communities who were active in struggle. Can you see? But organic capacity is to be found even among those who are not active. In South Africa, we can argue, we had some, I would call now right-wing, organizations like the Inkatha Freedom Party, of Gajabtelezi. They were killing comrades in the 80s in the so-called political violence. But a member of the working class who is a member of the IFP remains a worker. It means that there is something we can connect to, yeah. Workers are not saints, but there's something we can connect to, which is there in that worker. I know in the USA, comrades complain about the white working class or whatever you call them, the supporters of Trump. You worry about how Trump connected with this constituency. But we also on the left, you can connect, if we approach those workers, with understanding, with respect, with patience. being clear, that they face so many obstacles, some in their minds, some because of the result of history, which actually, covers up, this organic capacity to fight for a new kind of society. So basically, my argument, my research, which is why I had to visit so many shack settlements, was to tease out and identify and assure myself and my readers that indeed there is such an organic capacity. And also, these days you've got many different, legitimate theoretical approaches, postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, and many of these people, they don't see the working class as at the center of change. Can you see? Yeah. So it was also a kind of debate and a pushback against that straying away from the basic contradiction under capitalism, a capitalism which dominates the whole world, by the way, today, even in Russia, wherever, China, it's capitalist. It might be run by a Communist Party. So it means that, those classical formulations, okay, Marxism is not a dogma. It has to be developed, be tweaked, to be applicable. As Fanon said, Marxism must be stretched to make sense of the colonial situation. So, that is what I was trying to do. Yeah, thanks.
Do we have time for me to ask another question? I hope so. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from Peter. I wanted to come back to your kicking off point, Trevor, when you said, what can someone in New York learn from your book? And of course, New York, we are on the cusp, and for many people already in the midst of a huge wave of evictions, right? I mean, it's been somewhat held off by legislature that has prevented eviction, but many thousands of people are in dire straits, and all of this is about to crescendo up hugely. So, you talked about 2008 and the wave of foreclosures back then, but there's a similar kind of thing that is going to happen, and it's likely to be even more dramatic. But I think the way that things are usually framed in the US is in highly individualistic terms, right? So, it's about individual debt, individual inability to pay, and therefore eviction of individuals by landlords or by the state working at the behest of individuals. I think one of the things that's really important about your book is that you show the way in which eviction is a mass phenomenon, and that we need to see it in those terms, and to see the role played by the state in terms of backing up capital. So, you begin your book with the scene of occupation of some land by a group of shack dwellers, and then with the state forces, the forces of the municipality that come and demolish their shacks, and then how there's this kind of process of negotiation. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about how the role of the state in terms of enforcing the prerogatives of capital, and then how shack dwellers push back against that. And I'm particularly thinking about, I think you're really fascinating theoretical conversation about spontaneity versus organization, and how that plays out in terms of shack dwellers' efforts to sustain their claims and be able to stay in place against the force of the state that tries to evict them.
Yeah, well, the USA has got one of the world's biggest working classes. So if socialism is going to happen in the world, it has to happen in the USA. There's no question about that. No pressure, comrades, but it's like that. So I really like your question, Ashley, comrade. Yeah, so in my opinion, although of course, I'm a bit of a polemicist, trying to push back on certain views which kind of dominate these days. The first point in answer to your question and the issues you raise is that there is a class enemy. Okay, so this is quite important. There is a class enemy. There is a group of people who are controlling owning the wealth, wielding the power, monopolizing the wealth. And through that action, we have all this suffering, the homeless, joblessness, problems with accessing healthcare. Because of course, with housing, there is enough cement in the world, enough bricks, to provide houses for everyone. Everyone knows that, yeah. But why are so many people living in shacks? Why are people who have got homes, nice homes, losing them through foreclosures? It's because of the system of capitalism, because of this group of people who are trying to use everything which human beings need, not to use it, what we call use value, but to make money. Can you see? So that's the problem. That's the problem. So if they are a group, when they, implement their plans, exactly, Ashley, they try and confuse the situation by targeting people individually. Can you see? And, they've got something called private law, the law of contract. But when you just step back for 1 minute, you can see, oh, there's a group making money and a group suffering because of how this other group is making money. So we need to draw that class line. It's not that simple, because some people, they make it from working class ranks or from middle class ranks and become, big capitalists. Other capitalists fall down. Other middle class people, they become proletarianized. But in general, if you take a panoramic point of view, you can see a group of people, having it nice, laughing all the way to the bank at the expense of a mass, a big mass, the 99%. That is the class enemy. So evictions, yes, they say, Trevor Ngwane, you haven't paid, Ashley Dawson, you haven't paid, but actually we're all in this together. And then the shack dwellers, those who are seeking a house, they realize that I can't just take over land alone. We have to go together. In fact, the strategy is to go in as many as possible, so that even when the police come, if we are 10,000, at least 3,000 of us will still have our structures, our flimsy structures standing, okay? The most successful land occupations, land invasions, if you like, are the big ones, okay? So if there's a few of you, so collectivism, so we're going back to the organic capacity. So Marx says, how do workers produce, Well, the capitalists push them into big, large factories. So there's cooperation, there's collective production. But of course, the capitalists privately appropriate what is being produced, okay? So there's something that collectivism, which is working class, which is part of being, part of the mass. Yeah, I could say a bit more about the state, but basically the state does not stand suspended above class struggle, above the struggle between the group of exploiters and the group of the exploited. The state takes the side of the exploiter. Of course, it can't just do it willy-nilly, can you see, because there would be rebellion. So sometimes it balances things. Sometimes it has to discipline even the capitalists, because remember, they are also competing with each other. But in the end, the state is a capitalist state. And the capitalist class is the class enemy. And the working class, however, wherever they are, black, white, women in India, in the USA, in South Africa, in Malawi, they do share certain interest, against the exploit.
We're going to go to the audience in a moment. I had one quick question about forms of organization, because I was wondering about the relationship between how the committees form within the shack communities and party, the logic of the party and party representation of working class politics. From the research that you have done, Trevor, I think you could argue that the Amakomiti present a sort of a radical alternative to classical party-based politics, no?
Yeah. So yeah, it's like that only because of what has become what we call a political party, if you know what I'm trying to say. Remember, the Labour Party in the UK, how did it start? It was that force which was actually marshalling the power of the unions. Under Tony Blair, it became, a weapon against the working class. Okay, I'm sure you have a similar history in the USA. Over time, these organizations, including trade unions, by the way, these organizations which working class people form in order to organize their struggle, they tend to be distorted, reshaped to actually, carry out the job of the oppressor. It's what I call the politics of class collaboration, where the party leader or the union official starts to think that his or her job is to make sure that there is balance between the rider, the jockey, and the horse, instead of mobilizing the horse to rebel and kick the jockey off the horse's back. So this is basically what is happening. The worst part, of course, is what happened with social democracy in Europe, let alone, communism, Stalinism, where organizations, state organizations were turned around to serve the so-called market. So you see, the erosion of the welfare state, you see the erosion of social democratic politics and policies, by neoliberalism. Of course, under Stalin, in the communism, we see now the very ideal, the dream of communism being turned upside down. And we can see what's happening now in China. China is there, it's moving forward, but for all purposes, it's a capitalist economy, and it's causing confusion in mass consciousness. So these issues we cannot avoid, we have to address directly. That's why, some people say, shack dwellers are only interested, we hear it in South Africa, are only interested in getting a house. Oh yes, of course, but the air that we breathe is political. So those issues must not be left to so-called advanced intellectuals. Ordinary people are quite capable of understanding what is at stake and what, there can be no socialism by mistake. Millions of ordinary workers must say, yeah, we want socialism. That is how it's going to happen. So in a way, we are building towards that. And what we do as the cadre, as the intellectuals, as teachers, is just to make sure that our ideas, our teaching doesn't obscure, but clarifies the issue. Doesn't take away people from the working class, the engine of social change, and turn them maybe to false, solutions, so to speak. Yeah. That is, if you agree with my formulation.
Well, let's find out. I think our first question from those listening in is from Ruth, and then I believe Anne-Marie. Ruth, would you ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Trevor. Thank you so much for the wonderful book and lots to think about. So I have two very quick interrelated questions. The first one touches on the possibilities of shack dwellers and resistance to sort of shake the foundations of the state and state repression. And this question comes from, thinking about the fact that at this particular moment in Kenya, we have, two particular large shack settlements that have been completely destroyed by the government of Kenya that have existed for over 20 years, to build this expressway. So are shack settlements able to shake the foundations of the state and to make the state step up to the kinds of roles it's supposed to play? Or are they a band-aid? And I say a band-aid very, very respectfully, And then the second question is, again, on the possibilities of, spontaneous, not just spontaneity, but also thinking in the context of South Africa of the July uprising, where sort of a mixture of, whether it's those who saw it in support, the uprising in support of a Zuma faction, but also seeing it as a response of, the battles from below. So how do we make sense of such a mixture in a very unequal country? How do we make sense of this particular politics, which seems to emanate at that particular point from a support of Zuma, but then of course, do we make sense of it in that way, or do we make sense of it as a response to the thing that basically lights up, the fire that has been bubbling from below regarding the inequalities and marginalizations of majority of Black South Africans, of the masses?
Thank you, Comrade Ruth, for that question. I would say that the key concept I would use in answer of both your questions actually is what I call demobilization. So demobilization comes in two senses, two ways. Firstly, it's political in the sense of undermining, attacking ideas of the alternative. And then secondly, physical demobilization, when people send in police and other state forces to physically disorganize, a mass organization. So in South Africa, apartheid failed in using the second type of demobilization. They send people to jail, they kill people, but that just couldn't stop the struggle of the working class. Indeed, in the 80s, the struggle got stronger. It got international support, which was crucial. So it was unstoppable. So as Gramsci had pointed out, no state is going to rule, and no ruling class can succeed without, an element of consent, of getting the very oppressed to believe and buy into the ideas, hegemonic ideas of the ruling class. So in South Africa, in a way, we got our independence at the expense of not only physical demobilization, because Mandela said, yeah, now you can close your structures. For example, they closed down the United Democratic Front, which was a national structure, which was coordinating grassroots mobilization. You don't need the UDF now, you are free, okay? They closed down a lot of women's groups, some of them I'm still because I was a member of some of these youth groups who were told, close them down, join the ANC Youth League. Women were told, close down your structures, join the ANC Women's League. So that was, in a way, physical, organizational, disorganization, demobilization. But the worst type of demobilization, is the one of ideas. Then they started attacking the idea that there could be a socialist alternative. Now, Margaret Thatcher was very good with this. Tina, there is no alternative, okay? Yeah, so once that kicks in, then, the only thing now, the workers, they lose their confidence, they forget their own power, and then they end up engaging in desperate actions, as Ruth is talking about, because in July, hundreds of ordinary workers, went to these malls, took food, stripped them bare, but in the process, 350 people died. Can you see? So this is like a desperate action, it's not well thought out, and people maybe got a fridge or got some, I don't know, whatever they got, but it didn't really address the fundamentals. So demobilization is what we have to fight against. Now, scoundrels, political scoundrels like Jacob Zuma, who are part of the aspirant black bourgeoisie, which is in the ANC, which is in control of the ANC, they of course take advantage of this. When they are fighting their own internal battles, who must get the government contract, who must become president. They will try and link up with the so-called underclass, with the working class, with the desperation and lack of confidence and lack of vision among ordinary people. Our job is to remind workers who they are, to remind them that there is a power which can change all this, and that power lies in you, in that granny, in that aunt, in that uncle, in that youth. So this is part of regroupment and remobilizing the working class. But it's a very good question, which goes to the heart of my book. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you, Trevor. I believe Anne-Marie is next, and then Jay. Anne-Marie, you have a question?
Yes. Hi. First of all, Trevor, hi. It's been so long. It's so good to see you. I'm really glad to be here. I am based in California. Trevor and I met back in the early 2000s at the resurgence of community struggles in South Africa against water and electricity cutoffs. And basically South Africa was my training ground. And Trevor was an amazing teacher on that front. So I am going to really try to be as concise as possible, but my head is swirling with a lot of questions, and I'm also trying to figure out whether I should focus my question on struggles that I'm still connected to in South Africa for the last 10 years or more around land and water in the Ceres region outside of Cape Town that are ongoing, but also in terms of struggles that I'm involved with in the US, focused on abolition of immigrant detention and policing more broadly. But the last point, Trevor, that you said, and drawing on Gramsci, I think that's the hardest. I mean, the ruling class creating and poaching a segment of the working class, right? To create this aspirational culture. I think this is something in the US that with the rise of, particularly with the mass mobilization around anti-Black racism last year and policing, there's this constant tension between racism and actually shifting or orienting the focus around capitalism and racial capitalism. And there is among the what is so-called radical left in the US, there is a great recognition, acknowledgement of what is called the misleadership, the Black misleadership class. And again, I'm already spreading myself in different directions. I guess my question is perhaps to Trevor, but to all of us. I mean, so if I'm going to think in terms of transnational solidarity and struggles, what I am seeing more and more is that connection around policing and the carceral state. So my image was, I've been very involved in defending Cameroonian immigrants who are fleeing political crises in Cameroon, but that are created by US militarization. And there are struggles in the US to call for the abolition of AFRICOM and US militarization of Africa, and that are rooted in understanding of imperialism, and that's really hopeful. But if we talk about organizing with people who are directly impacted, this is a struggle that I find that people who either have been deported or have now been released from immigrant detention are actually now focused on living out their American dream, or also gripped by fear of speaking out in case they may be deported, or are not having any idea of US militarization of their of Cameroon and elsewhere. And also, what I have also found is talking. So I was in South Africa a couple of years ago, and talking about Cameroon is that South Africans are very, and Cameroonians are like, have a very narrow inward-looking focus. And then how do we then get back to the ideas of Pan-African struggle? So, so I think I've identified a few of the points in my head, and I'm so sorry if it's not very coherent, but if you can, and I know there's not really a question, but any comment would be gratefully received.
Yeah, so yeah, I know it's nice, comrade, long time. Yeah, unfortunately, not a lot has changed. So it's amazing that you ask your question after, the comrade who spoke, Ruth, whom I know, who is from Kenya, so there are those, and also this webinar, I mean, some of you guys are in New York, I know Mary is somewhere, I don't know, in Hungary. So in a way, the possibilities are there, can you see? Yeah, the only thing in the struggle is that there are possibilities and obstacles. So sometimes, we have no choice but to discuss and focus on the obstacles, can you see? But other times we have to, look at the possibilities. So one possibility which I'm putting forward is that there is a kind of structural unity which runs through all the laboring classes of the world, which was Marx's basic argument, workers of the world unite. Now, if we then take Gramsci, and all those Polanyi, all those people about ideology, we know that the ruling class uses a million ways to detract, from that idea, to attack it. And we all know that ideology is not just ideas. Ideology is materialized in how society is structured. So if the only way you can get a job is to put a CV and fight 1,000 other people who want a job, I can't blame you if you are kind of competitive. Can you see? Yeah. So I think that's the situation. The worst part, which is a bit discouraging, demoralizing, like you say, countries like South Africa, because they are in a way semi-peripheral countries. Okay. Yeah. So many people say South Africa is the USA of Africa. So you get among, South African leaders, politicians, sometimes seeping down to ordinary people, what I can call xenophobic consciousness. The idea that when immigrants come in, they take our jobs. Okay? Yeah. But it's the same with the USA. How did the USA become a world power economy? Okay? Okay, we can talk about the First World War, Second World War, but going back, it was slavery, which was the foundation. It's the same in South Africa. How did South Africa become one of the biggest economies in Africa? It was apartheid, it was colonialism, it was the killing, the murder, genocide, in Southwest Africa, Namibia, killing of miners, killing of women in the rural areas. So this is how we got to where we are. Indeed, during the struggle, many of us escaped into various parts of the world, especially in Africa. Can you see? Indeed, these very mines, which, are making all this money for Lonmin and other international multinational corporations, they used primarily, when they began, labor from Mozambique, labor from Malawi. Can you see? As the local people were still resisting. So someone once asked me, is there something called a South African economy? This is just a dream in your head. Can you see? Because our economy is inextricably linked, both historically, structurally, today with Swaziland, with Mozambique. So I think that those are real questions, real issues. But if we look more broadly, we'll see that there are possibilities. There is a way in which you can approach workers with understanding, with patience, and with respect, take into account the many obstacles, which they face, the many hardships, confusions, which are layered on their heads. How Zuma yesterday was leading the national liberation movement, today, is leading, the struggle of the aspirant black bourgeoisie to make money for themselves. So I think there is hope without maybe undermining, the challenges ahead. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Trevor. Jay, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be very quick because I have to race off in 10 minutes to a governance meeting at the College of Staten Island, where Ashley also works. And we're dealing with some of that brutality that Trevor was just going over about we have a resolution around getting justice for a Black cafeteria worker that was murdered by the NYPD on our campus 10 years ago. But the question I had, and it was a great presentation, what really interested me was kind of the relevance for the struggles that we're facing at CUNY. And I've always argued, and others, one of the potentials for us to fight back is to unite with our students, those that were in another interdependent relationship with common demands and united struggle that could really make some advances and kind of disrupt the whole narrow collective bargaining approach. But our union has been very much tied to, alliances, lobbying efforts with these foundation funded Democratic Party orbited NGOs, which has gotten us nowhere and worse since when I was 12 years ago at a CP seminar over a decade ago. So the question is, was there any effort by the movement against the utility cutoffs and reconnections to unite with the utility workers, and if they were unionized in any kind of united effort? And if that did happen, what was the experience?
Yeah, so as soon as the ANC took power, of course, they moved away from that dream of, jobs for all, electricity for all, water for all, to jobs for those, who the bosses can afford to employ. The state cannot create jobs. It can facilitate, provide the conditions for investment, looking to private capital, private property to provide jobs, ignoring the fact that by definition, private property is stealing, it's taking over. People are not homeless because there is no cement. They are homeless because they are dispossessed. If the cement is there to build houses, if the houses are there lying empty, then those people have a right to those houses, but they are dispossessed. There is a state which stops them from getting what they want. Fortunately, the student movement here in 2015, which started off as Roads Must Fall, especially in the University of Cape Town, it linked up with a movement against the outsourcing of workers, cleaners, gardening staff, security. So it just so happened that there had been a long struggle against outsourcing, against contracting out, in this campus. So when the student moved, they found conditions in an organization ready to link up with that struggle. And then fortunately, when this movement spread throughout South Africa's, only 26 campuses, in almost every campus, this demand was taken up. Can you see? And then using a kind of Black consciousness, the students were saying, we don't want the Black child to suffer. And who is the mother of the Black child? Is the working class mother who cleans, at the university. So somehow the struggles gelled, and then the students and some progressive faculty joined the struggle to get, the cleaning workers, safety workers insourced. And indeed, in almost every university in South Africa today, the cleaner is employed directly by the university. So that was a decisive victory, and it shows the possibilities. Of course, the students did not win much, because every university talks about decolonization, but you know how the professors just manipulate it into a slogan, into filling KPIs, performance appraisal, tick, 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 I did decolonization. But one thing for sure, all workers in all the universities, they are now employed directly by the university bosses. So it was a significant struggle. Of course, we do have a problem now with workers in Eskom. Eskom is the state-owned company, which is commercialized in the way it operates, but it's owned by the state. So you find workers there, in a way, they're being corporatized, they're being persuaded, to take care of their interests. They tend to get more money if you compare with other workers, in South Africa. So there's this attempt to turn these workers, against communities, but it's something we're always fighting against. But please continue with that struggle in Kuni. And in fact, I once came to Kuni and I was inspired by the effort you comrades put in there and your union. Yeah, so please keep on fighting. We're here, we know, we notice. Comrade Jay.
Thank you, both for the question and for your answer, Trevor. Ashley, we have time for a couple more questions, either from the audience or from us.
Well, I have a question, but I want to make sure that all members of the audience have a chance to speak. So is there anybody out there who has a question before I go? Okay, well, hearing none, let me ask my question. So, Trevor, I wonder to what extent environmental struggles can be seen as an issue for Amakomiti. And I'm asking this because, can you hear me okay? Okay. I know that just recently there was a big conference in Cape Town held by the Alternative Information Development Center and another number of other organizations about trying to shift away from a kind of ideology of extractivist capitalism in South Africa. And the reason I'm thinking that could be important for shack dwellers organizations is that on the one hand, environmental crisis in South Africa is going to drive many more people into cities when they can't survive, off agriculture in the rural areas. And then people living in the cities are going to struggle increasingly with, the conditions that they're confronted by environmentally in terms of getting access to increasingly expensive food and other kinds of things. So, the kinds of struggles over service provision that you've worked in the future, I think are likely to be intensified along with a whole kind of raft of other struggles. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit sort of about these kind of bigger ideological questions around the extractivist model in South Africa. And, if you see the possibility for urban movements as playing any kind of a role in that kind of a shift, do shack dwellers see some kind of a future in shifting away from South Africa's extractivist model, a model based on mining and fossil fuels towards a different kind of a future?
Yeah, so yeah, we had that meeting, but one of the things which I got from COP26 was a speech by Greta Thunberg, I think, but the youngster, where she said, it's all blah, 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 So this really struck me, this it's blah, 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 blah. And it's not as if blah, 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 blah is confined to, American presidents or I don't know, Putin in Russia. Here too in Africa, it's just blah, 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 blah. And the worst part, the bourgeoisie now, they say to the South African government, will give you so many millions of dollars for you to do this and this is part of tying African countries, tying, these developing countries to the agenda of blah, 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 blah. What is blah, 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 blah? It is green capitalism. So they want to accommodate the fears. Some of them are not stupid. They can see there's a problem. But as Marx said, the captains of industry, they are the personification of capital. They are slaves of capital accumulation, the logic of accumulation. So in a way, they can say this, but they are tied. There's this, locked in to extractivism. Can you see? That's why, every year there's a new gimmick, new trick. It can be carbon trading. It can be carbon capture. I'm sure they'll come with something called fourth industrial carbon, I don't know what. Yeah, because they don't want to admit that their system is the destroyer of the earth, the destroyer of nature. Something actually Marx wrote about, the metabolic drift, and then people are only now finding out about what Marx was writing about. Only now understanding what was in Marx's mind, So already, it was clear theoretically, what is going on. I'm telling you, these people, they are the personification of capital, and they cannot change. So there is no struggle really against climate change, against extreme weather patterns, against the dislocations which are already starting to happen as some areas of the world become too warm, too hot to be habitable. We're going to be faced with carbon taxes. Carbon taxes is another gimmick. I'm not saying, it's not useful in some respects, but who will suffer? Workers will suffer. Can you see? Yeah. So I don't see how, we can really come out of this quagmire without confronting the system itself. There is a slogan, system change, not climate change. So it is, in a way, we can also view it as a possibility, an opening. Yeah, in our meeting in Cape Town, some unionists, because we also had union leaders from Soweto, which is still in the pocket of the ANC. But after 2-3 days, their argument was not sustainable, if you know what I'm trying to say. It just is not sustainable. And of course, they are operators. You can hear them changing and shifting and twisting. But the fact is, the struggle against, global warming, climate change, extractivism is a very important platform, in the struggle against capitalism, in the struggle for a different kind of society. And at the heart of that struggle is workers, because workers are the producers. They've got the power to stop all this in one go, simply by sitting at home and saying, we're not going to work, by doing nothing. So our job is just to develop that consciousness, develop that solidarity, remind workers of their power, and then one day they'll realize it. Maybe at first it will be pockets, but sooner or later it will happen. The earth will really become inhabitable, and we'll start fighting each other, and then maybe it will be too late, but at some point the penny will drop for the masses, for the millions.
A good answer. I had a quick question about political translatability, because one of the things that I found really interesting about your book, Trevor, was the discussion of land invasion, occupation, and squatting. And, obviously, as political practices, some of this occurs in US politics, but some of it is untranslatable at the level of state force, let's say, right? There's a standing army in the States called the National Guard, which is not to protect against foreign invasion, but to protect Americans against Americans, right? And so over things like property and land, there is somewhat fierce state resistance. So I just wondered whether you could say something about the translatability of the agency that the settlers showed through their land invasions and occupations and squatting.
Yeah. In fact, that's the real challenge, for a book like this. But I'm confident, because sometimes if you go into one, that's why newspapers, bourgeois press, they like these so-called human stories. Can you see? So, they take a big issue, just take one little story and then go on about it. And people can relate to that. Oh, this is what happened to this guy. Oh, no, it shouldn't happen. So sometimes, rather than preaching to people, you tell them what happened or what's happening in one part of the world, what's happening. And then, you have to trust they are thinkers. Gramsci said everyone is an intellectual. Gramsci, in fact, said everyone is a legislator. Everyone can make laws. It's just like bourgeois politics, bourgeois political science tells us that there's a special class and group of people who can make legislation. So through those stories, and of course, pointing out here and there, this could be relevant to your situation, that situation, I think people will eventually make sense of their own situation. Marx said, the working people have no country, but everyone must first face their own bourgeoisie, because conditions differ. There is one big divide, we all know, imperialism. Some countries colonize other countries. Some countries are still, ascendant because of that, historical crime. So that division, is open to manipulation by the bosses, is also open to manipulation by the elite in these oppressed and exploited post-colonies. So these are things we have to deal with, which is why we write books, because, it's not straightforward, can you see? But ultimately, sometimes it boils down to the appropriate slogan. Okay, land, peace, spread, because it connects with how and what the masses are feeling. So that is why I was saying, as revolutionaries, we have to keep our eye to the ground, understand the mood of the working class, understand what they're thinking, understand what they are fearing, be patient, and then perhaps some of our ideas, can connect, and, that organic capacity can be released, liberated, and the working class will take its rightful role as the leader of social change for a different kind of world. Another world is possible.
Well, that's a very good place to end our conversation, perhaps, in this session today. It may be a slogan that's sometimes overused, but I think if anybody reads your work, particularly this book, they'll understand what you mean by possibility and political possibility in the present time. I'd like to thank you, Trevor, for your participation today. I'd like to thank Ashley too for not only his wonderful introduction of you, but also for his pointed questions in the conversation that followed. I'd also like to thank the questions from the audience, from Ruth and Anne-Marie. I think Jay has already left us, and I hope that this isn't the end of our conversations, and that the next one, Trevor, might be in person rather than in rectangles. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Thank you,
Congrats,
Trevor.
Trevor.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mary.
Nice seeing
Bye.
you, Trevor, and thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you to Peter and Ashley and Tare.
Thank you all for
Thanks,
attending.
Mary.
Yeah, take care,
Bye.
Trevor. Nice seeing you
Bye-bye.
again. I'll be in